Our next speaker wears many hats. She is the director of the 3A Institute. She's a distinguished professor at the Australian National University. And she's a vice president and senior fellow at Intel. She's a remarkable woman and a terrific speaker who's prepared something brand new for us today. She's going to be commenting on some of the cultural impact of these technologies. She's an anthropologist and a technologist and a futurist. And so please join me in giving a great big welcome to Genevieve Bell.
Clicker? Beautiful. All right, well, I don't actually know how to follow that, so let's imagine we're going to do a slight change in gears. Robert, I'm impressed by how much Australian coffee you've obviously been drinking, and we thank you for that. I, on the other hand, have to confess I haven't had any coffee this morning, so I'm going to be speaking a little slower than some of you are used to. And I wanted to pivot from where Robert ended and move the conversation both in a more speculative direction and really auger in on that last point that Robert said he thought the future entailed, which is this notion of what would it mean to think about artificial intelligence, to think about machines that have a capacity to act without reference to pre-written software rules and what that world would look like. And because I thought this was an event that had both hybrid in the title and was in Adelaide, imagine this is less about the answers and more about the questions we should be asking about the future. I think we're in a moment in time when the future is not yet fixed, and there are an enormous number of questions we might want to ask about the future we might want to inhabit and the future we might want to build. And often that means allowing that there's a little bit of uncertainty and that there are questions to be asked. And in particular, in honor of Adelaide and what I think of its great kind of contribution to Australia, which you might argue is about, Power's not a bad football team, the chocolate's pretty good, the beer is excellent. I actually think that one of Adelaide's principal contributions as an export industry continues to be in the arts sector. And so I really wanted to think about how we could think about the future of all of this technology around the creative industries and what that would look like. So there's lots of ways to introduce myself. Robert did the usual, here's a whole long list of titles. Here are the other things you need to know. I am an anthropologist, Robert's right. I'm also the child of an anthropologist, so I spent my childhood living in central and northern Australia in the 1970s and 1980s. I grew up at places like Ali Karang, and my big town was Tennant Creek. It was a remarkable childhood. I got to spend my time with the Warlpiri and the Kaiditch and the Alyara and the Warramungu in a period in time when those settlements were new. And I spent most of that childhood living on Aboriginal country with people who told the stories of that country to me. I was lucky enough not to have to speak English terribly often. I didn't wear shoes, and I got to kill things a lot and then eat them. I hasten to add, because otherwise I sound like a burgeoning psychopath. And it was a remarkable childhood, and it's a very long way from there to Silicon Valley, where I've spent the last 25 years of my working life. I ran away from Australia 30 years ago, did my education in the United States, did a PhD at Stanford in Native American studies. So I was interested in thinking about Indigenous people and the relationships between Indigenous people and the nation state. I was very interested in the comparison between the US and Australia. And when I finished that PhD, I ended up on the faculty at Stanford, teaching Native American studies and feminist theory. It's a very long way, it turns out, from there to Silicon Valley, although Silicon Valley was just outside the door. And I ended up at Intel, where I've spent the last 20 years, really in a way only an Australian can end up anywhere, which is that I met a man in a bar. In the middle of the dot-com boom in 1998, and like many American men, he didn't have a particularly good game in that bar, because what he said to me was, first question, what do you do? Really, that's the best you've got? I told him I was an anthropologist. He said, what's that? I said, I studied people for a living. He said, why? I should have guessed at that point he was an engineer. I said, I thought they seemed interesting. He asked what you did with that kind of thing, and I said I was a professor. And then I thought, I'm done with this conversation, and I left. Because really, conversations about one's work life in a bar in Palo Alto in the 1990s didn't seem like a good idea. So it was a tremendous surprise to me when he called me at my home the next day, because we are talking 1998, pre-vaporization. So in 1998, if you wanted to find someone, you couldn't use Google or Facebook or Twitter or Tinder or even a white box on the internet called Google. He did this the old-fashioned way. He called every anthropology department in the Bay Area looking for a red-headed Australian. And Stanford said, "Do you mean Genevieve?" and gave him my home phone number. Which just means we thought about privacy differently then. And one thing led to another, and Rob turned out to be a venture capitalist. He turned out to be a serial entrepreneur in Silicon Valley. He turned out to know everyone, and he turned out to like wayward anthropologists. And so he took me to a lot of meals. I met a lot of his friends. They all had jobs descriptions I didn't understand and jobs that made no sense. Because it was 1998, and it was Silicon Valley, and it was the middle of the dot-com boom, and basically people had jobs with job descriptions that were utterly incomprehensible. And ultimately, Bob asked me to join his company. I said no. He then introduced me to the people at Intel who hired me. Now, being hired by Intel when you've come from being a professor at Stanford is a long imagination jump. I frankly took the job for two reasons. One was that I was lucky enough to be raised by a remarkable parent, my mother, who impressed on my brother and I as small children that you had a moral obligation to make the world a better place, and not for yourself, but for others. I'm just on that transition generation where we still thought that service with a small s was the thing you should do. And I thought I was doing that teaching. I couldn't see how being in a big tech company could possibly be a notion of service, until I realized that the thing about Intel and all the companies like it in Silicon Valley was that they were building the future, piece by piece, brick by brick, piece of technology by piece of technology. And they were doing all of it completely absent any conversations about human beings. It was all about what Intel used to call in the day speeds and feeds. It was about megahertz. It was about Moore's law and integrated circuits halving in size and doubling in density every 18 months. It was about the speed of the network. But at no point in any of those companies did someone ask, so what are the humans going to do with all this stuff when you've built it? Or better yet, if we asked human beings what they wanted, what frustrated them, what inspired them, could you use those things as a starting off point to innovate new technology? So rather than saying, here's what's technically possible, now tell me how to use it, what if you inverted that paradigm and said, here are the things that people have the most difficulty getting done, here are the things that frustrate people, could we use that as a place to jumpstart technical innovation? And I realized that Intel didn't have any social scientists. They certainly didn't have any anthropologists. And they were willing to hire me. And so I took the job. I landed there on my first day. My new boss sat me down and said, there are two things we need your help with here at Intel, Genevieve. And I went, yeah, okay, what are they? So, well, the first thing we need your help with is women. Like, okay, which women? She's like, all women. I'm like, you need my help with 3.2 billion women? Okay. Yes, my boss said. I said, okay, what do you want me to do with 3.2 billion women? And my new boss said, it would be great if you could tell us what they want. I'm like, okay. An age-old question, I thought to myself. And in my notebook of the day, I wrote down women all and underlined it and tried to imagine what is the project you would do that would explain women all to a tech company. That didn't seem terribly easy. And so I'm sitting there having a think about that project, and I realize this new boss has told me there are two things. And if thing number one is women all, it is a little scary to contemplate what your new boss thinks your second task might be. I think I secretly hoped it would be men, because then I could just explain all human beings, and that would be good. But no, this new boss says, listen, here at Intel, and again, I have to caveat this, 1998, so like a bazillion years ago, she said, here at Intel, we have an ROW problem. And I'm like, okay, well, I have a problem too. I don't know what that acronym stands for. I'm like, okay, what's rest of world? ROW, she says, rest of world. I'm like, oh God. Like, where's world? So that you have a thing called rest of world. She's like, well, that's America. And then there's the rest of the world. And we have a problem with it. And we're so excited because you come from there. And I took a deep breath and I thought, okay, so my job description is explain women and everyone who isn't American. Okay. I think that's a kind of permanency of a job I wasn't otherwise expecting. Because basically my job description just became explain everyone who's in the building to everyone who isn't in the building, or vice versa. Basically, can you make a technology company understand people not like them? And so my job for the last 20 years has been to do precisely that. How do we tell stories about people, not as consumers, but as human beings? As people who have particular countries and places and legacies and things they care about and rituals and habits. And how do we use all of those things? Not so that we can imagine erasing them, but so that we can actually imagine building them and making them and having them be what sits at the heart of all technological infrastructure. So that's been the job. I now do that job out of the Australian National University as well as at Intel. So I spend a lot of time on planes and in Qantas lounges and contemplating things. And it's in that context that it is very hard to escape the conversation that Robert ended here with, which is a conversation about artificial intelligence. When I first started at Intel, it was a conversation about the internet, then the web, then mobile devices, then apps, then APIs, then the cloud, and now AI. But one of the things I'm really struck by about all of this is what's missing in that conversation and what we might need to include in it. So before I talk about AI, I want to put a stake in the ground about something else, which is I think when we talk about technology, we spend all of our time talking about how technology is good for business. We talk about technology and economics. We talk about companies and jobs and profit lines and profit margins and numbers of users. We talk about consumers. We don't often talk about people and humans and about all the other things that technology is and can be good for. So rather than imagining that this next wave of technology has to always be about the productivities and efficiencies that have in some ways shaped the last 250 years, I want to put a stake in the ground here for a slightly different metric. And I know for my friends in government, this is a pretty wishy-washy metric. I'd like a wonder metric, but I'm going to suggest we should give it a whirl. And South Australia is the one place I think we have a better chance of it than anywhere else in Australia, given our commitment to film, the arts, literature, and many other things. So what do I mean by wonder? Well, there's the classic, definition out of the Oxford English Dictionary. A feeling of amazement, of admiration, caused by something beautiful, remarkable, or unfamiliar. Can also be a desire to know something, to feel curious, or even to feel doubt. That feels like a remarkably different thing than a technology that is all about efficiency or productivity. This suggests notions of engagement, immersiveness, pleasure. It means, heaven forbid, we might have to have conversations about aesthetics beyond just the style of an object and the look of a user interface. It might mean we would need to think about why curiosity and knowledge are also important things. And guess what? The history of technology, certainly in the last 100 years, but arguably in the last 300, every new piece of technology that has been created was used not just in the service of business, but in the service of the arts and creativity, in the service of making things beautiful, in the service of other things in that space. The very first thing to be electrified in Great Britain wasn't a factory, it was a church. The second thing to be electrified in Great Britain still wasn't a factory, it was a theatre. Because it turned out electrifying theatres made it possible to have a completely different experience of the theatrical. The most important technologies of the 20th century, and maybe Robert and I will disagree about this, but certainly the most game-changing technologies that had the widest impact on human beings in the 20th century, electricity, the radio, television, and the internet. And what's the thing about all of those technologies? Well, a couple of them weren't in the service of making us more efficient and more productive. That would be television, in case you were guessing. It is a technology that we love. It is a technology that is in all of our homes, even if it's not in a classic screen. We still like a good story told to us by someone that moves us. The internet may be about productivities, but the vast majority of traffic on the internet is still emails that mostly contain the words, "Hi, what are you doing? I'm running late." Movies, where Australia specialises in that particular feature, and pornography. So again, not about efficiencies and productivities, but about human emotions and human activities. So what would it mean to say the future we're building is a future that shouldn't just be about economic rationalism in the classic cast? The conversation we shouldn't be having is just not entirely about factories and companies and money and market sizes? What if there's also a conversation we should be having about human beings and citizens and engagement and wonderment? And yeah, I know that sounds terribly naive, but I think there are reasons why that is an important part of the human condition. And in fact, frankly, one of the challenges of the 20th century was that we wove our notions of democracy and notions of capitalism so tightly into each other that we forgot that citizens and consumers aren't the same things, and that human beings are yet a third thing. And how we celebrate all of those pieces when we think about new technologies requires asking different questions. The question shouldn't just be about what is the company, but who are the people? How will they feel about it? What is the work that it is doing? What is the work it isn't doing? Why? And for whom? So, if you imagine that the 21st century isn't just about a litany of technologies and technical systems, but it's also about humans. It's about being human. I think a notion of wonder might be one of those things that makes us human. Now, of course, wonder is a cultural idea. There are some cultures where the notion of being curious or having doubt is dangerous. I've spent 30 years in a culture that doesn't like doubt very much. I've certainly come home to a culture that sometimes wonders about things that are unfamiliar. All of that said, I think imagining a metric for the future that isn't just about productivity and efficiency and isn't just about classic macro Keynesian economics might be a good thing. So what would it look like if you applied that to artificial intelligence? Robert talked about AI, and I'm willing to bet most of you hear the phrase artificial intelligence on the radio, in the newspapers, on the internet, in podcasts, in all manner of conversations. One of the interesting things about AI, however, is that it is a word that is starting to feel a lot like innovation. Everyone says it, everyone nods. If you actually asked everyone what they thought it meant, they'd all have different definitions. And the challenge here is that AI is one of those really loaded terms. And it requires a little bit of unpacking in order to think about what is the world we are going to build with it. So there are a couple of ways of defining AI. You could parse the words apart, and I always think there's sort of pleasure to that. Like artificial intelligence. Semantically and semiotically, what's going on there? Well, it helps if you know this is a term coined in 1956 in America, where artificial was good. Think also rayon, nylon, NutraSweet, instant coffee, synthetic fabrics. The notion of something being artificial meant that it was tidy, unlike nature, which was messy. And of course, intelligence here was terribly narrowly cast as being things about logic and education and rational decision-making. So you can tease apart the word. I should think you do just as well to give it back its history and its original definition. Because the thing about AI is it is a term coined by a particular person at a particular moment in time, and God love him, he wrote it down. Gotta like that about scholars. This is as much of a demo as I have right here as my bit of paper. So, in 1956, there was a conference at Dartmouth College on the east coast of the United States. A bunch of mathematicians, philosophers, and logicians got together with the explicit task of spending the summer of 1956 hashing out a research agenda that would take advantage of computational change. In the decade preceding 1956, computers had gone from being a thing basically the size of this room that required 156 kilowatt hours to power. You thought you had power problems in South Australia. Imagine if computing took up this room and required 156 kilowatt hours every time you turned it on, which meant every time they turned this original computer on, the lights in the entire of the city it was located in flickered. And citizens of Philadelphia would say, oh yeah, they're computing at the university again. That's why the lights have dimmed. So between 1946 and 1956, the power of computing changed dramatically. And in 1956, a bunch of scientists got together and said, if this continues at this rate, wow, this is going to be pretty cool. Like, what are we going to do with it? And so they decided that what they wanted to do with it was take advantage of the way computing had always been described up until then, for at least the 30 years preceding that, which was as a giant brain. And that stopped being a metaphor and became a literal instruction. And in 1956, what they said they wanted to do was proceed on the basis of the conjecture that every aspect of learning or any other feature of intelligence can, in principle, be so precisely described that a machine can be made to simulate it. What is that again? So that every aspect of learning and any other feature of intelligence can be so precisely described that a machine can simulate it. Pause and contemplate that, right? In 1956, a group of mathematicians and philosophers and logicians believed that you could effectively break down what it is that makes human intelligence into sufficiently small pieces that a machine could simulate it. They figured that might be a bold claim, and so they said there were 4 things in particular that they were interested in against that backdrop. One was how to make machines use language, so not programming language, in this case they meant human language. Form abstractions and concepts, solve kinds of problems reserved for humans. It's delightfully vague. You would not get an ARC grant on the basis of that now, but in 1956 the NSF gave them a lot of money for that sentence. And then improve themselves. So 4 things: understand language, handle abstract concepts, do things that humans now do, and learn, improve over time. And that was the entire sum of the artificial intelligence research agenda circa 1956. The important word there being the machine. So they imagined they could build a machine and it would do all those things. So where does that get us, right? Well, it's a long way from 1956. And in the many years in between, attempts were made to do all of those things. Learn language, handle abstractions, do things that humans did, learn. And they failed spectacularly. If you're in the AI field, you talk about the AI winters. And they were deep and long and painful. And governments withdrew money because, of course, if you promise in 1956 that a machine's going to understand human speech and it doesn't, it's not a good look. At some point, someone says, we're not giving you any more money until you solve that problem. And it really wasn't until this last decade that there were significant enough changes in the world that made it possible to deliver on those promises from 1956. But the world had also changed in that period. Robert described a whole lot of it. We had software that wasn't available in 1956. The price and power and size of computing changed dramatically. What it meant to talk about computers was no longer to talk about an object the size of this room, but to have a thing that you could put in your pocket. And most importantly, what changed was data. Robert can talk about teraflops of data, and he's right. But what that data also did was made it possible to create that thing that they were seeking in 1956. Enough specificity to describe a problem such that a machine could replicate it. So, 2018, how do you describe artificial intelligence? Well, I think you have to describe it by its component pieces. I think that's the easiest way to do it. And for me, there are 4 component pieces that you have to keep in mind whenever someone says to you artificial intelligence. You have to remember that AI always includes data. It can't start without it and it can't proceed without it. Now, there are problems because of that, because you have to ask where did that data come from, who collected it, under what circumstances, what isn't in the data. But let's imagine data, part 1. Part 2 is that AI constellation of technologies relies on algorithms. Basically, an ability to scale and automate. So algorithms are, it's a complicated word, but it's a really straightforward thing. If you've ever used a washing machine, you've used an algorithm. Because if you go to a washing machine and you put the cycle on that says wool, the machine goes, oh yeah, wool, right, cold, not a lot of spin, 1 rinse. That's an algorithm. It just says if A plus B, then C. It is simply an ordering of tasks. What you can do inside AI with data is you no longer need to have a human in advance say what the ordering of tasks should be. The algorithm can be basically built in real time in response to what the data says should happen. That's all an algorithm is. It's just an automation of a set of tasks in a particular order. Now, of course, what that means is that someone has imagined what the relationship is between those tasks and the order that they should happen. And whether that's human or machine-based, there's still a worldview lurking inside of it. So data, algorithms. Third piece is that all of these machines are also predicated on notions of how they would learn. So what's called machine learning, what also might be deep learning. But basically, how is the machine, in this sense, capable of producing those algorithms? How can it take data and learn new things? Not the things it was programmed, but basically change over time. And there's a whole series of techniques for doing that sit under the bundle of things called machine learning. Fourth piece of the AI constellation is sensing. So you have data that's previously collected, you have algorithms for structuring things, you have machine learning for learning new shit. Well, think about all the technologies that Robert was describing, but let's pick just an autonomous vehicle. For an autonomous vehicle to function in the world, it needs to be able to sense the world around it. You can preload a whole lot of data in it, but it needs to know what road it's on, whether there's anything in front of it. God forbid that thing in front of it is a kangaroo, because that turns out to be really complicated for autonomous vehicles, but different problem. So sensing tools involve things like cameras, speakers, microphones, anything that lets it sense the world, basically. So an entire set of tools for how you make sense of the environment so that an object can move through it. So the robot doesn't hit the human or does pick up the basket of laundry and not the small child. Whatever, right? It needs to have a set of tools. Those are 4 things. I think there's a 5th that we don't talk about so much in AI, which is about what is the decision-making framework that's holding all those things together? What's the rationale or the reason or the strategy for deploying those sensing tools, for collecting that data, for analyzing that data, for building new algorithms? It's a bad word in the computing spheres, but what is the logic of the AI? What's it trying to get done? Like, what's its purpose? Is it, a vehicle, in which case its purpose may be about safety, but also about energy consumption? Is it a lift, in which case it may be about moving people from point A to point B, and the people are incidental because it's all doing inside a power budget? But what's the logic, basically? What's the brain, the strategy? So those 5 things. You can imagine any one of those things should be subject to tremendous conversation, but let's go back to that stake in the ground I put about wonder. What's it like to think about all of those pieces? Data, algorithms, learning techniques, sensing tools, and decision-making frameworks, if you imagine that what we wanted AI to build wasn't a factory, but something that produced wonder. Well, I think there are a couple of ways you'd start to go, right? One is to say, well, listen, are there new ways we could think about the data? The way you think about the data if you're trying to drive a more efficient factory might be really different than if you are trying to deliver a powerful television show. So there's certainly those pieces, right? And we know that there is a tremendous amount happening in this space. And Australia is actually one of the centres of excellence in terms of using data inside the social sciences, humanities, and the arts. So the notion of the digital humanities basically being pioneered here in Australia. It's now in other places. There's a couple of strong centres globally, Rutgers, University of Alberta in Canada. But Australia has some of the traditional real strengths in the digital humanities, i.e. how can you take advantage of large data sets to tell the stories that humanities scholars have often told? Are there ways that humanities scholars and social scientists see data that lets you generate a different outcome, ask harder questions? Or perhaps ways that social scientists and humanities and arts people know how to visualize data that isn't just here's another graph. And here there are lots of people doing interesting things. At Caltech, so the California Institute of Technology in Pasadena, #1 ranked university in the world, they have an artist in residence. He's been there for 20 years. He's a conceptual artist. His job is to help scientists see data differently. When he first started there, one of the first things he did was take the physicists in the physics department to an art gallery and make them stand in front of Monet and talk about how Monet used light and colour to create an impression, and then made them go back to their labs and think about how they were visualizing data. And did art let you see the word differently? Would it open up a conversation that you wouldn't have expected? So we know that's possible, right? And what's interesting for me about that is not necessarily all about art in the service of STEM, but in some ways something quite different, right? Maybe STEM in the service of art. Like, what would it mean to start unpacking those things? You could look at Deb Verhoeven's work recently at UTS, but on her way to the University of Alberta, using data to question the money that sits behind the creation of the arts sectors in Australia. So could we use data to analyse how art is being produced, who's producing it, and where the money goes? Would end up asking a different set of questions, particularly as we worry increasingly about, is our art representative? Does it tell the stories of our nation? Are there other ways we might want to think about that? Are there other pieces there that we could use to unpack those things? And then there's just the very notion of patterns, right? When I listen to the people I know who work in this space, who spend their time with data sets, and here you should imagine one of the most interesting and arguably troubling things about data is that it's always retrospective. Data's always in the past. It's always what's already happened. Data isn't the future, it's the past. And the thing about that means it's really hard to use data to imagine a future different than the one that we've lived in up until this moment in time. Because if you're using data that was already collected, it maps the world as we know it. It's a little hard for that data to talk about a world it's never seen before. And one of the things we know about art in particular, but movies and fiction too, is that there are moments in those creations where a different world is imagined, a world that doesn't look anything like what has come before. Think about the relationship of the avant-garde and Cubism and Dadaism and the Angry Penguins to everything that came before it. Those are radical shifts. If all you'd had was what was there before, you wouldn't get to something different like that. So one of the challenges about data is at one level, it's conservative. It can't help itself, right? It doesn't have a purpose in that sense, but it's always retrospective. So what does it mean to think about how you might create things given that context? And are there different ways of imagining how you would curate data? Are there ways of thinking about different categories of data? Are there ways of thinking about structuring different data sets? If you imagined that what you were looking for was beauty, wonder, things that historically have been a little hard to document, can we do that? Arguably, should we do that? But if this technology is all-pervasive, I think at some level we have to do that. So that's the data piece. Second piece is about algorithms. So I said before, if you've used a washing machine, you've used an algorithm. If you have been on the internet in the last 20 years, and I don't assume that's everyone, but I'm going to assume it's most people in this room. If you have used the internet in the last 20 years, you have encountered an algorithm. If you use the ABC, iView, Netflix, Google, eBay, Gumtree, pick a website, you've encountered an algorithm. Mostly what those algorithms were about preference and taste. They said, if you liked this, you're going to like this. If you watch this, then you're going to watch that. If you swiped right, you might swipe right again. All it did was structure the world based on alignment of things being like other things. Of, if you like that actor, here are a whole lot of other movies she's in. If you like that director, here's a whole lot of other things she directed. If you like that location, here's a whole lot of other things in that location. It worked on echoing things you've already selected. Now, of course, the challenge there is that most of us in this world have had a moment, whether it was with television or music or food or clothes or even your friends, where you thought, oh my God, if I have to hear that story one more time, I'm going to just, what we call the familiar paradox, that things that are familiar are really comforting. That television, that's really comforting because it's just like the other bit of television, and that's really comforting because it's still really comforting. It's familiar, 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 familiar. Getting subtly bored, familiar, desperately in need of something different. If you're a TV producer in the US, you know this. These are my buddies at HBO who worked out that there were only so many shows about housewives you could greenlight before you might need Game of Thrones. Which is not unrelated to the housewives sequence, but is a little bit different. And they worked out that there were enough signals in the market that people were bored with the thing that was the same and looking for something different. One of the challenges of the world we are creating, however, is that most of the algorithms that are being built, because they are based on the data that already exists up until now, they cannot but help reproducing the world as it has been, not the world as it will be. And getting an algorithm to go, hey, are you bored? Because if you're bored, boy, do I have something different for you, isn't how algorithms work, for all kinds of reasons. And yet, imagine what that would be like. Imagine what it would be to be able to have, I don't suppose you want it every day, but you might want it occasionally. You come to Adelaide with your ubiquitous smartphone in your hand. If it's me with my ubiquitous smartphone in my hand, I'm usually looking for coffee, because I'm always looking for coffee. Adelaide is a good place to look for coffee. But I'm perfectly willing to imagine my smartphone might occasionally, and it would have to be irregularly, say to me, yeah, Genevieve, we know you want coffee. And there's really good coffee just down there. But there's this piece of public art around the corner that you should go stand in front of for 5 minutes because it's beautiful. It's also nice outside, so you should go sit under a tree. Or did you know that you were standing on the people of the lands of the Ghana people? And you should stop and acknowledge that. What would it be to imagine, rather than all of our algorithms being utterly and entirely straightforward and pragmatic, that occasionally they were about surprising us, that they were about delighting us, that they were about deciding that all that stuff you'd watched up until now wasn't the stuff you should watch moving forward, or that you were ready for something slightly different. Up until now, all sorts of people did this for us. The waiter in your restaurant who tells you that there's something on the menu she thinks you'll like. The people that make podcasts at the ABC who greenlight a whole lot of things, not knowing if all of them are going to work. A friend who says, I read this book and you should read it. The person who says to you, I know you want coffee, but we need to go get dry ice. And you think, I wasn't expecting that, but cool. All of those are moments where the world doesn't order the way it always has. And again, I'm willing to bet for most of us in this room, we have had an experience of being somewhere and we took a wrong turn, we didn't end up in quite the place we expected, and whatever was at the end of that street or that road is more powerful a memory than had we been where we were supposed to be going. So what does it mean to imagine that we could be architecting technology that might also make that happen? Because otherwise we run the risk of an entire portfolio of algorithms that freeze the world as we're in it right now, and that's all they'll ever be. Oh, plus they'll work out how to sell you more stuff. And I think that's not necessarily the world I want to live in. So what does it mean to think about, could we build an algorithm for delight or wonder or surprise? It means changing some of the ways we think about doing all kinds of algorithmic building, because it's if A plus B, never C, sometimes F, sometimes delta, sometimes a different word. It would challenge all of the ways we know how to automate things, but I think these are questions, again, that are worthy of asking and worthy of thinking through. Which gets me to, how do you think about learning? I said before that one of the principal components of artificial intelligence is learning techniques, so basically machine learning. The notion of how do you teach a machine to learn things? Well, up until now there's two ways, what is called supervised learning and unsupervised learning. Supervised learning basically takes the computational object, sits it inside a data set, says to the computational object, when this happens and that happens, this should happen. Now go find that pattern in the data. Effectively, it's like Catholic school. You should think that. Supervised learning is just like learning by rote. It's how most of us in the room learned our times tables, painfully. We did not intuit them, we learned them by repetition. That's what supervised learning is. You teach the computational object what the pattern is, and then you make it go find the pattern. That's great unless you got the pattern wrong. Second way of doing it is unsupervised learning. Think more Montessori. But basically you say to the computational object, here's a lot of data, there are patterns in it, go find them. Dirty little secret here about unsupervised learning and most machine learning, and indeed all of this stuff, is it is really power intensive. I noticed in Robert's list of the future he didn't have a lot to say about the environment and sustainability. One of the things I will tell you is that at this point in time in 2018, 10% of the entire world's electricity budget is spent on server farms. So that cloud into which everything is going, that accelerant, that is 10% of the global total electricity budget. So it may be invisible, but geez, it's sucking up energy like it would going out of business. And sure, companies like mine are working on making that computation more and more energy efficient, but we're also talking about increasing the density of that computation exponentially. And at some point, that's a net zero, steady state, possibly even a net loss. Which means there will be times when, in fact, the notion that we need technology may be hard to do against the backdrop of, do we have the electricity for it? I can fully see places where we might not use AI, even if it is more quote-unquote efficient, because it is in fact masking an incredible drain on electricity. Deep learning is power hungry, and it doesn't necessarily get us anywhere good. You can learn things more easily in other ways, is basically what I mean to say. So, If you imagine, however, that you've got these learning techniques, right, there's two of them. Basically, here's the data, here's the pattern, here's the data, find the pattern. One of the problems there is imagining, well, there's a couple of things, right? How does a pattern represent creativity or wonder or something else, right? If your only mechanism for learning is learning patterns, is that how we teach the arts? Is that how we teach creativity? It's a way of doing it. Is it the only way? Is it actually about repetition? There's certainly artistic traditions in the world where there is no notion of original art. There are, in fact, just constant reproductions of good art, and the spirit in which you do it is the thing that matters most. I can kind of see that here. But what would it mean to think that in addition to these patterns we already have for teaching computational objects about data, we had to teach them about imagination? And we have an interesting challenge here, right? These computational objects don't have a body in the traditional sense. Most of us, our bodies, our physical selves are hugely important to how we create things. They inform all sorts of things. These computational objects don't have bodies in the traditional sense. They're not embodied. So how do we think about that, right? And what would it mean to start imagining all of those things? How does that work? How would you teach an object those things? And then, oh, by the way, if you did, how would you signal that you'd done it? There's a big argument going on in Spotify right now, or about Spotify, so an American music service, that suggests that they are using an algorithm and machine learning to work out what kind of music people like and produce synthetic copies of that music in order not to have to pay royalties. So they've found a way to learn music, reproduce it enough, and get themselves out from underneath having to pay artists. I mean, that is an interesting logic of late capitalism, but also a troubling one. What does it mean? Does Spotify need to signal that those objects are computationally built, not human built? I don't know the answer to that. But it's an interesting question to contemplate, right? Would you need to? Would it change the way we felt about it if you knew it was made by a machine? If that art was created by a computer, do you feel different about it? If the music was created by a computer, not a person, do you feel different about it? This piece of art here, quote unquote art, was created by an algorithm at Google called Deep Dreaming. And they took a whole series of images and ran it through this algorithm with the notion of kind of creating an unconscious. They are spectral and weird images. And I have to ask the question of, do we call them art? And if we did, what does that say about what we make? And what does that say about the future? And then almost last, but by no means least, in this kind of gallop through everything here, when I said that AI was also about sensing techniques, right? So cameras and microphones and speakers and capacity to have GPS and temperature and all of those things. At the moment, as humans, we have a limited set of those at our disposal. What would it mean if we had more of those tools? Would we see different patterns in the world? Would we do things differently if we could? Would we take on some of those tools for seeing the world and use them to make different things? A woman named Lynette Walworth won a series of International Film Festival prizes for a piece she did called Collisions. It's one of the first pieces of VR work come out of Australia. It's extraordinary. It uses VR, but it uses drones. It has indigenous versions of storytelling. It's mostly set up in Maralinga. It is an interesting moment of saying, can we take new and novel forms of sensing and use them to make art? Are there ways that having a different kind of eye on things produces different sorts of art? Definitely people who used X-ray technology back in the day to make art using X-ray paper. We know that people have used cameras to create art that they couldn't create when they were using a canvas. We know that new forms of technological capacity to sense the world have made new art. But how would that feed back into these systems, right? Does it need to have a feedback? Can we just tease out this piece about the sensors and say, well, they let us make new art, so that's great, we'll just do that? Or would we want to say, well, some of these technical systems actually should be making art using that? Or does it challenge the way we think about data? Again, I don't know any of the answers here, but I think there is an incredible array of technology that is being created and utilized, and at the moment it is being utilized for things like border security and facial recognition, and policing, and social surveillance, and crowd control. And I wonder if there are other options and other ways of thinking about that same technology doing other things for human societies. And if so, what would those things look like? And then last but by no means least, one of the other things I said here that was important about AI is what is the framework by which it's all tied back together again? What is the reasoning, formulation, what is the mechanism? If you think about the big companies making AI today, Google, Facebook, Amazon, Baidu, Tencent, Apple, Tesla, a few others. If you push on them and ask, what is the logic that informs their choices? Many of them are remarkably straightforward. For Google and Facebook, it is about how do we know you, really know you better than you know yourself, so that we can anticipate what you can do next, so that we can sell you things. They are the ultimate manifestations of a particular kind of logic, right? The AI there, the knowing you, is in the service of consumerism and consumer culture. The logic there is knowing you to sell you things. For Baidu and Tencent in China, which is an AI built on a completely different data stream and an AI built on completely different data, the logic that back-ends those is we want to know you exquisitely and your social relationships so that we can promote social harmony. Because social harmony is a social good inside the communist and Chinese government. Those are two very different ideas of what AI might be and what it might do. And I can guarantee you those different ideas inform the choices that those companies make about what bits of work they do and what bits of work they don't do. What would it be to imagine other logics? Back when I was talking about wonder, there was a picture in the background. It was from the Royal Shakespeare Company 2 years ago in Stratford-upon-Avon, when the Royal Shakespeare Company partnered with Imaginarium, so the people that did all the computer graphics for Lord of the Rings and Intel. And the partnership was about staging the Tempest, so Shakespeare's last play, arguably his weirdest play. It's a very trippy play. And the Royal Shakespeare Company came to us and said, had Shakespeare been alive in 2018, we reckon he really, well, 2016, we reckon he really would have liked all this new technology, so we think we should put it in the play. We were like, okay, we have no idea what that means. And so we came to Stratford, along with some other companies, and ultimately what it meant was that we instrumented the actor, Ariel, with motion capture technology, and we did real-time manipulation of an avatar of him on stage. No one had ever done it before. Usually when you're doing real-time motion capture, you're doing all of it on a green screen and then you're editing it in a studio somewhere and then maybe it'll get to film 6 months later. We did it in real time. We used some augmented reality techniques, digital projection cameras, a bunch of algorithms to produce the rabid dogs barking and running across the screens. We had new projector technology. We had enough computational power in the globe at Stratford to keep the space shuttle in space. We had 5 servers in that building in order to make it all work. It pushed our technology further than anyone had ever pushed it, doing anything in a server farm, anything in a classic workload by any company. This was much harder to support than anything my company had tried. And the most exquisite and extraordinary piece about it was when the curtains went up and the play started, only those of us in the room from Intel knew what was about to happen and no one else did. And we all sat somewhere else in the theatre. I sat with a bunch of people and I could hear them stop breathing at the point that Ariel flew, because humans don't fly. And there was Ariel basically flying across the stage. And at intermission, the woman I was sitting next to looked at me and said, "Did you know that was going to happen?" I'm like, "Yep." She's like, "Anything else like that going to happen?" I went, "Yep." She's like, "Don't tell me." She's like, "I just want to have the magic." And I realized at that moment in time that magic is also really important. Arthur C. Clarke well-known science fiction writer, a very long time ago, said that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. Far be it for me to tell Arthur C. Clarke he's wrong, because he's also dead, so he doesn't have the right of reply here. But I actually think what he meant to say was any sufficiently advanced technology should be able to make magic. It shouldn't just be distinguishable from it, it should be able to deliver it. And when I think about what it means to have a world of data and clouds and hybrid technical systems and the Internet of Things and smart systems and robots and machine learning and artificial intelligence, all I know is that we can't work out how to stay human inside all of that and with all of that, that's not a good look. And one of the ways I know that we are robustly and constantly human is because we like to make things. We want to make experiences and stuff. We want to make art and beauty. We want to make people laugh. We want to make people cry. We want people to experience wonderment. And giving up on all of that stuff just because the technology isn't built for it seems to me to be a travesty. So, hybrid world, Adelaide, 2018. Here's the challenge. You are surrounded by the technology that will make the future. Let's make sure we are making a future we want to live in. So with that, I want to say thank you and stop.